Hey, welcome to our walk through Romans. I'm so glad that you're joining us. My name's Leon DeHaan, and I'm here to help you to understand this wonderful book of the Bible. Now, today we're in Romans, the first chapter, starting with verse number 14. Now, before we get into the teaching, let me just say this. At the end of this podcast, there's our web address. If the Holy Spirit is leading you to help us in bringing about this teaching around the world, I want to ask you to go to that website and then hit the give button and give as the Holy Spirit leads you to give. You know what? You will be a blessing to us here at Thrive Ministries, but you will also be a blessing to people all around the world. Every week I get reports of people listening to these videos, and they're not just people in the United States. There are people all around the world that speak English, but they listen to our videos and are blessed. And so when you do that, it'll be a big help to us and to them. Now today we're in the chapter 1, verse number 14 of Romans, and the Apostle Paul says something here that's really really impactful in our lives when you understand what he says. He says, I am under obligation both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish. What's Paul saying? When the Apostle Paul says, I am under obligation, if you were to look at that word in the Greek language, the language that Paul spoke in, wrote in, you would find out that this word obligation probably should be translated, I am indebted. You see, the Apostle Paul has been talking for the past several verses about something that's on the inside of him. Something that the Spirit of God is raising up in his spirit. And it's causing him to want to go to Rome. It's causing him to want to produce fruit in Rome and a whole list of other things. And by the way, go back and listen to the other podcasts this week to get a better understanding of this. But then now Paul says this. He says, I am under obligation. I am indebted. Let me ask you a question. You ever been in debt to something and then paid that off and you just feel like, it's done. I am free. I am free. My wife and I have been blessed to be debt free for many years now. And you know what? It is such a good feeling that I don't have to write a check to the bank every month. We remain debt free. Now we don't live high. We don't have a mansion, but you know what? Everything we got is paid for. You see, the Apostle Paul is feeling that he has to pay something. He has to give something back. Let me ask you this question. What if every believer would come and operate in their life with this idea, I owe that person something. I want to see that debt erased. I owe them something. Well, that's what the Apostle Paul is saying. That's what he's feeling here in his spirit, man. It's rising up on the inside of him saying, I've got to do something about this. I need to make a payment. I've got to do something. And so Paul says, I am under obligation. I am indebted. And then he lists two different types of people. First of all, those that are in social standing. He says, I am indebted both to the Greeks. Now, the Greeks were the highest of society. They were the philosophers. They were the people that everybody respected. They were the people that everybody wanted to be like. They were high society. They had the nicest houses and they had the nicest vehicles and whatever. I mean, everybody wanted to be like them. And then he says, I am indebted both to those people and to the barbarians. Now, when he says barbarians, we could say that it's the non-Greeks, and that's the way the Greek people understood. They thought anybody who wasn't Greek was a barbarian, a thief, a liar, a cheat, homeless. But notice what Paul says. Paul says, I'm under obligation. I am indebted to the high society people, but I'm also indebted to the low society people. What's Paul saying? Paul's covering both ends of the spectrum. And he's saying that we as believers, and he's saying I as Paul, I'm saying I as Leon am indebted to people. It doesn't matter if they're a homeless person or if they're the richest person in the world. I am indebted to them to bring the gospel. Wow. Do you know that you're indebted to people to bring the gospel? You say, well, I'm not a preacher. Well, you don't have to be a preacher to bring the gospel. Remember, we talked earlier this week, I think on Monday, about the Romans. How did they receive the gospel? They received the gospel from common, ordinary people. The disciples had never been to Rome. Paul had not been to Rome at that time. So they received it probably through Cornelius or through his soldiers and people like that. But we need to, as believers, we need to understand that we have an obligation. We are indebted to bring the gospel to all people. And then the Apostle Paul says both to the wise and to the foolish. To the wise and the foolish, all people. And now moving on to verse number 15, it says, so for my part, I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. Paul's saying, I got to do my part. I've got to fulfill this indebtedness. I need to pay this debt off. I need to come to you. I need to preach to you the gospel. And let me just say as we close this session, every believer has a debt to pay. It's not the debt to pay that deals with sin. Jesus paid for that. But it's a debt that we owe other people, and that debt is to preach to them the gospel, to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. I pray that in your heart, in your spirit, man, that the Spirit of God is rising up on the inside of you saying, go into all the world and preach the gospel. Thank you for watching. Join us again next week as we continue our walk through the book of Romans.